Speakers Bureau and our program chair, Sasha Vanovsky. Sasha?
Thank you, Dick. It's a real honor to introduce our guest today, but it was also very hard for me to pick which parts of his long, successful career to mention without taking up the rest of the meeting with this introduction. From being international trade negotiator for the United States to a founding member and twice chairman of the highest court of the World Trade Organization in Switzerland. Also, for 14 years, he chaired the global practice of the largest law firm in the United States. He was elected to represent Florida in the United States Congress. He was an active member of congressional committees on science, space, technology, banking, and other financial services. He was also elected as a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations since 1995. He's also a published author. Trade and Freedom was published in London in 2004. The Willing World, Shaping and Sharing a Sustainable Global Prosperity was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. The Financial Times, one of the leading financial newspapers in the world, named The Willing World one of the best books of 2018. Please welcome Professor James Bacchus.
Thank you so much, Sasso, and thank you all. I'm grateful to my old friend Bill Pieper for inviting me to join you once again. And it's always a pleasure to speak with the Rotary Club of Orlando, which does so much to serve our community. You are exemplars of the right kind of citizenship, one and all. And in speaking to you today, I realized that much of what I'm about to say is a message that you as individuals do not need, but it is a message that I think that all citizens need at a time of grave concern about our country's future. I'm here today to share with you some of my personal thoughts about the leadership I believe we are missing in America, the leadership we very much need in our great country if we are to meet today's many urgent challenges. In my youth, I was taught about leadership by the example of Reuben Askew, Florida's greatest governor, and according to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, one of the 10 greatest American governors of the 20th century. Some of you may remember him. A few of you may have known him. I met him when I was 20 years old. I became his youngest aide, and I served alongside him in a number of different roles for a decade. During my own years in public office, I tried my best to follow and live up to his example of the right kind of leadership for our democratic republic. Still today, I continue to be inspired in all I do by the power of his example. And as I witness and lament in many ways what poses as leadership in our polarized politics today, Governor Askew's enduring example reminds me of the true leadership we are missing. The leadership we are missing is optimistic. True leaders are realists. They see the world as it is and not as they might wish it to be. Yet they always believe that tomorrow can be better than today for all of us. They hope and work for human progress. They believe there can be such a thing as human progress. And they are persuaded that, as Karl Popper put it, we each have a duty of optimism. The leadership we are missing appeals to the best in people, not the worst. True leaders strive always to lift people up, to help people become their best selves by appealing to what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. True leaders know that we, the people, will always fall short of the ideals we espouse, but even so, they always seek and expect much more from all of us in making a more perfect union. The leadership we are missing brings people together. It never pulls them apart. True leaders look first for common ground. Then once they have found it, they try to build on it. They know, as James Madison and the other founders knew, that there will always be factions. There will always be groups with differing views and interests within our democratic republic. And they understand that if our form of government is to continue to survive and succeed, then we must construct on common ground through compromise. The leadership we are missing is also truthful. True leaders always tell people what they need to hear, even when it may not be what they want to hear. True leaders believe, as Edmund Burke did, that elected representatives owe those who elected them their best judgment, and that they betray them if they sacrifice that judgment to the majority sentiment of the passing moment. They know that if their judgment proves to be mistaken, the remedy is at the ballot box. The leadership we are missing is also factual. True leaders rely on proven facts backed by evidence and telling the truth. They do not try to deceive the people by ignoring facts or by inventing and presenting fantasies as facts. They acknowledge and affirm that there is such a thing as objective truth based on facts, and they're willing to trust the people with the facts, whatever the facts may be. Lastly, the leadership we are missing is respectful. True leaders do not talk down to the people. They do not talk differently to different kinds or groups of people. And they certainly do not disparage the people. Nor, whatever the justification, do they disparage the character of their political adversaries. For in our democratic republic, our political adversaries are also our fellow citizens. Politics is the way we make our decisions. It is not the way we discern good from evil. These tenets of leadership are more easily stated than followed. They can only be followed if a leader values serving the people more than being elected or reelected by them. Governor Askew always said, you have to be willing to risk losing the election in order to be able to serve the people in the right way once you are elected. He had the highest regard for those in politics who he called risk takers. But of course, the risk takers who risk following the tenets of true leadership will lose elections if the people are unwilling to vote for them. Thus, the success of the right kind of leadership depends on the exercise of the right kind of citizenship. We as citizens must be willing to vote for those who take the risk of telling us the truth, even when we would prefer not to hear it, and we prefer instead a candidate who simply appeased us by telling us only what we want to hear. In trying my best to show genuine leadership by following the example and the principles of Governor Askew, I have not lost any elections, but I have also not sought elected office for some time. I do not know if it is possible to adhere to the principles of true leadership and win political election during this dispiriting time of routine prevarication and relentless character assassination. I hope that it is. I hope that more will try, And I hope that more of us will support them when they do try. For I do know that we will never again have the leadership we are missing unless we rediscover the kind of citizenship that is necessary to make the success of true leadership possible. We as citizens must be willing to be optimistic, be our best selves, come together and compromise on common ground, hear and heed unwelcome truths, accept and act on undeniable facts, and treat our fellow citizens with respect. We as citizens must also be willing to vote for candidates who take the risk of showing true leadership. If we do not, then we will have only ourselves to blame for the continued decline of the quality of the politics in this much blessed land we all love. One of Governor Askew's favorite quotes, one I heard him say a few thousand times, was by Pogo, the classic American cartoon character. Pogo said, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Thank you very much. If you have time, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, or do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Professor Askew. Our first question comes from Bill Pieper. Bill?
Jim, you might have answered part of it, but in your eyes, what do you think it's going to take to get the two political parties to start to respect and cooperate? And what's going to take in these highly rigid ideological times?
Well, as I just said, I think it's going to take a different kind of leadership, and that requires that people with a different approach to leadership be willing to run, and it requires that we be willing to support them. And what will it take to make that possible? There are several impediments to the right kind of leadership now. One is our media, which is as politicized as our polarized parties are, and is, I think, on all sides much to blame for the quality of our current politics and for how much it is degraded. If a politician says something that is unpopular now, then that person is not applauded for showing political courage. That show of political courage is treated as if it is political gaffe, a mistake, because what reasonable politician would actually say anything that most people would not want to hear them say? Part of the problem is, of course, the money in our politics. I think the Supreme Court of the United States made an historically terrible decision back in 1978 when, in a case called Buckley v. Vallejo, it first ruled that the spending of money on politics is an expression of freedom of speech. That led us through a series of cases to where we are now, where billions of dollars are spent, and where billions of those dollars come from we know not where, because there's not even a requirement that they be disclosed as to their sources or amounts. Too much money means too much deception and too much distraction, and not enough true representation in politics. I think also that we need to come to terms with the fact that we truly do not have what most people would describe as a Republican form of government. And that's because we have distorted our representation through gerrymandering. In California and in Maryland, the Democrats do the gerrymandering. In North Carolina and Florida, the Republicans do the gerrymandering. Both parties distort the political shaping of districts when they have the chance to do so. Right now, Republicans are doing more gerrymandering because they control more legislatures. It's not because they're less virtuous in that respect. We need to have equal representation, and we don't have it because gerrymandering ends up creating legislative districts at the state level and congressional districts at the federal level that lean to the extremes and disenfranchise the middle. People of either party are elected only if they can appeal to the most extreme elements of their party, and they can be defeated only in primaries by people who are still more extreme. In such a situation, why would anyone look to the middle for common ground? Why would anyone be willing to compromise? Those are some of the reasons why I think we are in the situation in which we find ourselves. The distortions of the media, the distortions of money, and the distortions of gerrymandering.
Dick, if I may, kind of just a quick follow-up. I know Emerson has some very interesting questions to ask, but without getting into the issue.
I have as long as you folks do.
Great. Without getting into the topic of presidential politics at the moment, you talk about leadership, and for the parties to come together.
I'm talking generally about all our parties.
Right. So you may have answered the question. My question was going to be what's going to take to get the leaders of the Senate and the House of Representatives, regardless of political party, to see the light and assume their greater responsibility. Can that happen?
Well, the founders in writing the Constitution rightly were skeptical about the exercise of power and feared too much concentration of power, so they invented the checks and balances that we have, borrowing from Montesquieu and others. The Senate is meant to be different from the House. The House is meant to represent the broad population as a whole and be more readily answerable to them through two-year terms. The Senate is meant to represent the states and to be perhaps a bit more reflective of the longer term by virtue of having 6-year terms. And I certainly support the Constitution. I've sworn to uphold it in the military and Congress and the White House, and I didn't note any time limits when I swore allegiance all those times. But I think the Senate would be more functional if we eliminated the filibuster and allowed a majority of senators to prevail when they have 51 votes or 50 votes plus the presiding member of the Senate, the vice president, as the Constitution allows. Some people say that this departs from what was supposed to be. But the truth of the matter is the filibuster is not in the Constitution. Some of the people who defend the filibuster say that it guarantees that small states will not be overrun by larger states. But that's why we structured the Senate as we structured it. And that should not change. The filibuster just makes it doubly difficult to do anything. So I think that has to change. And then I think we'll begin to see more deliberate action in a cooperative way by both of the houses of our federal legislature.
Thank you, Professor. Our next question is from Judge Emerson Thompson.
Professor Bacchus, you've had many careers. You were a student at FSU Law School and working in the Florida legislature at the same time. You were an aide to Governor Askew. You were elected to Congress. You've been in private practice, and you served on the World Court. What was the most difficult transition for you, and can you tell us why?
Well, that's a very good question, Emerson. And by the way, how are you, old friend? And Merry Christmas. That's a very good question. I've never found any of these transitions difficult. I've enjoyed doing everything I've ever had the privilege and the good fortune to do in public life. You know, as you can probably tell from my remarks, I take great pride in having been an aide to Reuben Askew. And that set the stage for all else I've been able to do. It wasn't difficult for me to go into the Congress. I was well prepared to serve in the Congress, given all else I'd done previously. It wasn't difficult for me to go into the executive office of the president and become a trade negotiator. I prepared for that as well. And of course, Askew was there. I went there because he became United States Trade Representative. I was his special assistant. It was not difficult, as it turned out, for me to go to Geneva and help form the World Trade Court. I simply used the principles I'd learned in previous roles to build a consensus around the round table of the appellate body of the World Trade Organization. And I'm quite proud of the fact that every one of the 60 international trade disputes that we judged while I was there was by consensus. They were all unanimous. I'm even prouder of the fact that in the years since I left in 2004, the appellate decisions in Geneva, every one of them, have been by consensus. That's done much to enhance the international rule of law and trade. And I'm quite proud of that as well. And I found the move from the law firm to UCF to be easy as well. My colleagues at UCF made it easy for me, and some of them quickly found out that I was not a politician who'd ended up in the academy. I was actually someone who'd started out in the academy and had lost his way in politics and found his way home. I had set out when I was a graduate student at Yale decades ago to become a professor of history. My graduate degree's in history before I got a law degree. But I was lured away by the siren song of politics in the form of Reuben Askew.
Let's move on then. The next question is from Ellen Schaefer. Ellen?
Yes, hello, Professor. How you do? Very appreciative of your experience and your opinions. Very interesting. I'm telling you where you talked a little bit about the majority centralists that there are in the United States. What can the leaders that are coming on now do to be able to help us avoid the pitfalls that both the extreme left and the extreme right are trying to push onto the central group of people? What can they do to protect us from those ends?
They're going to have a hard time doing it with all of the, you know, shall we call it nonsense that's going on nowadays. If you read Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, as I think you probably have, you see that he worries a lot about the majority running roughshod over the minority in a democracy. He was right to worry about that. The true test of any democracy is what it does to protect minority rights. We certainly have to protect minority rights, but in my view, we have the opposite problem now in many ways, and that is the majority is not being represented. The majority, because of the Electoral College, does not necessarily prevail in our national elections, and the majority is pretty much ignored. The vast middle in the primaries in both our major political parties. Both parties just opposed a state constitutional amendment that would have had open primaries and enabled independent voters and others to vote as they chose in primaries. Right now, they're disenfranchised. They have to join one or the other party in order to be able to vote in a primary. So in November, they're picking among candidates about whom they had no say. And the parties on 1,000 different issues, both of them are not reflective of the majority view in the United States. I'll give you just one example, which I happen to be quite familiar, and that's international trade. At this point, both parties are opposed to international trade. They're opposed to free trade. This is one of the few issues on which Democrats largely agreed with the Republican administration under President Trump. But if you look at the polls, all of them, you'll find the vast majority of the American people are in favor of lowering barriers to trade. My own fellow Democrats are always surprised when I show them the numbers showing that 2/3 of Democrats, even a larger percentage than Republicans, are in favor of freer trade. They're shocked to hear this. This is because they only hear from special interest groups in the political primaries that tend to oppose trade. And so they shape their positions accordingly. This happens in both parties. And here in Central Florida, where we benefit every day from international trade in goods and services, tourism, by the way, is trade and services. We don't necessarily have a full-throated support from all of our representatives for that overwhelmingly majority sentiment. So I'm concerned about our country now because we can't get anything done. See, that's the problem. And unless we can prove anew that a representative democracy can work and get things done, then we're going to be left behind by the rest of the world.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you.
Professor. Let me recall Nelson, who has a question. Apparently his computer dropped off. So Nelson, if you would ask your question.
I think what you talk about is right on point. But one of the collateral issues that we have is that we have the big tech companies and also the news media that basically have taken sides against common sense. And we talk about the politicians, and what you're talking about is right. Eventually the political parties will settle the difference and basically come to the middle or come to an agreement. But what to do about the big tech and also the news media that basically are taking the subversive, I mean, they're fire throwers on everything that they do, or they basically talk about on the news. Did you have any ideas on how to mitigate that?
In terms of, by the way, among my youthful sins, I was a newspaper reporter. I was reporting for the Orlando Sentinel in Washington when I was 22. And I met Askew when I was 20 because I was covering his campaign, his first campaign for governor. And so I'm not one of those people who sees the news media as the enemy. I think with Jefferson that our first defense must be of a free press, and there it is in the First Amendment, as it should be. But I think we need to take a look at restoring the fairness doctrine in broadcast journalism. There must be some resemblance between what's reported and what's actually factual, and there also must be some attempt by those who purport to be objective, in fact, to be objective, by allowing the reporting of both sides of any issue. In terms of big tech, I think we have to do what we set out to do when we enacted the Sherman Act in 1990. We had to enforce the antitrust laws. And we have to understand that concentrated power, when it's too concentrated, whether it's in government or in the private sector, can be dangerous. And we have to curb that power for the sake of retaining our representative democracy.
Thank you, Professor. Our next question is from Jim O'Reilly. Jim?
Thank you, Professor. I really appreciate your comment just a moment ago that power seems to have been somewhat more centralized than most Americans would like. In fact, many of the problems, in my way of thinking, is rooted in a federal system that has just become so big and unwieldy that no matter who the leader or group of leaders are, it's just not going to work. And I'm curious, because I think the founding fathers were brilliant in many respects, and they already laid out a solution for us in the 10th Amendment, which is that any powers that aren't specifically ceded to the federal government revert back to the states or the individual voters, which I think removes a lot of the power from the federal system, because quite honestly, the federal government tries to be all things to all people. They spend more money than all but a few of the countries on earth in terms of GDP, which to me is mind-boggling, and yet we don't seem to be solving problems. For example, the poverty rate today is not significantly different than it was 30 years ago. We could go on and on and on, get into that. My question really revolves around what your thoughts are as a judge on the international scene, because I think the 10th Amendment is what really separates us from many other countries around the world.
I started in state government, not in federal government. And the views I took with me to Washington were views that I developed in Tallahassee. And in Tallahassee, I worked for a man who believed that things should be done in Tallahassee only if they couldn't be done locally. So there was a reason why my campaign slogan was from the grassroots up. I believe in bottom-up governance. And I believe it works not just for the United States, but also in terms of global governance. The book that was mentioned, my most recent book, The Willing World, goes on at great length about that. In case you're interested in reading, it's on Amazon. I'm busy writing more books now. But the description you've given us is a description of federalism. Interestingly, as I learned more about how other democracies govern themselves, I learned a lot about the European Union. And it differs from us in that while we're different states that are part of one union, the European Union is a union of still sovereign states. And they have a concept called subsidiarity, nothing that really rolls off the tongue, but the notion there very much resembles how I feel federalism should work. And the idea is that on any issue that needs to be resolved, the resolution should come at the level of government where it is most likely to be effective and can be as close as possible to the people themselves. As an example, when we used to have revenue sharing between the states and the federal government, there were some who wanted to dictate to the states how that money should be used in detail. And then there were others who wanted to give block grants to the states and leave it to the states to make those decisions. My view has always been that you can establish a broad category, an area in which certain funds ought to be used, say transportation. But you shouldn't dictate to the states exactly where all the roads should be. They should be able to use that money within reasonable bounds by filling in the details themselves. In any type of decision of this kind, there is a line that has to be drawn. And I've always thought the line is drawn best when it's drawn on a case-by-case basis. When you don't try to do anything hard and fast that tries to predict the future. This is where I think government goes awry when it does go awry. The exercise of freedom is necessarily contingent. We don't know what the future will be. And if you try to shape what the outcome of what the future will be, well, it's not going to turn out right. This is why it's best to have a market-based economy. A market-based economy is one in which price signals tell us what the right outcomes are to be. No bureaucrat in government can do that. I opposed managed trade, whether it comes from Republicans or Democrats, because I think that the outcomes in trade should be determined in the market, because those are the most effective outcomes, and those are the outcomes that will produce the most prosperity. And I see part of the problem you described as being that government sometimes tries to plan too much and dictate too much what the outcomes should be. And I think that attitude is reflected in how states are treated and how the private sector is treated. By the way, I am not a socialist.
Good to know.
Although I was accused of being one.
Professor. Let me go on to our next question from Tom Reich. Tom?
Okay, my question is back and more specifically on the social media realm. In this last election, it could be said that Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube did steal this election. We now know that Hunter Biden did or was under investigation for taxes, for the laptop. Those of us that listen to Fox put it on our YouTube, put it on our Facebook, and were banned from YouTube and Facebook for even putting it on there. Democrats and liberals never knew it happened until yesterday when the FBI announced, yes, in fact, this has been going on. They did a poll that now says 5% of the United States would have voted for Trump that voted for Biden because of that incident. So it can be said social media actually changed the outcome of the election. Is that not treason? What do we do about an organization that's so big, so powerful that their political beliefs are allowed to change the nation? They're not a government. They're not even really a business.
Well, as I said earlier, I think we need to break up big tech, and that includes the social media. We need to enforce the antitrust laws. I think also one of the problems we have in our country is that we're beginning on all sides to throw around reckless terms like treason. Because the social media companies are private firms, they're under no obligation to carry anything on their platforms. The freedom of speech we have protects us against restrictions by governments, not by private firms. This raises the issue of the extent to which any of these companies should be treated as public utilities, which could change the terms of that. This is something I think the next Congress will be grappling with. I think there's concern on the part of both parties about this situation. And I think there's ample concern for it.
But you were a reporter. It was pretty obvious in this election that the majority of the news media were on the Biden team, period. End of sentence. They made no bones about it. That the guy on the morning show on NBC on Sunday started referring to it as we and us when Biden and the Democrats did something good. I mean, is that impartial reporting? Is that what the fifth column is supposed to be doing?
I haven't seen much impartial reporting in recent years, and that bothers me.
I mean, no question, Fox is the other way, but
yeah,
neither is right.
Forget Fox for a minute. Let me speak about CNN and some of the others. I'll give you an example. This happens all the time now. There's reporting on some particular event. Reporter comes on to speak to the anchor person, tells who, what, where, why, and when. The basic journalism
right.
W's, and then ends their report. So far, so good. But then the anchor person now routinely weighs in with some editorial comment. Oh, that's terrible. That's that shouldn't be allowed. This, that, or the other. Proper journalism would not include such a report in an editorial fashion. When I was a young reporter, I was fortunate to win a great many awards, and I was very proud when I was about 20 that one of the awards that I won was handed to me by Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite would never have done these things. And this happens on both the left-leaning and right-leaning networks. It's hard to find somewhere that doesn't lean. And that's not a good thing. I do a lot of writing of op-ed pieces for a variety of publications. I had last week I had an article in the Wall Street Journal, and I had one in the Hill. I had one in Foreign Policy. I've written for Bloomberg, and I do television as well. But I tend only to do the TV channels that act impartially and report impartially. I don't do CNN, and I don't do Fox. Occasionally I do Fox Business, which I found to be reasonably straightforward. This is a great concern because of the creeping commercialism, really, into journalism. These things are not happening just because the reporters are biased. They're happening because the companies that own them are seeking a particular audience and thus are both appealing to and feeding their bias. This is downright dangerous. I don't know about Hunter Biden. If he's violated the tax laws, he needs to be punished. But, and that would be my view, regardless of his paternity or his party. But I think you're basically right that it's hard to find a place that's makes a real effort to be objective.
But when I was growing up, and I went to college in the 60s. So names like Everett Dirksen and others like that when you listen to them, they always talk not in terms of what they wanted, but what was best for the country. I remember that very distinctively, but we don't really hear that anymore. Where did we lose our way?
I think we began to lose our way in the 60s. Ironically, at a time where we were finding our way in some other aspects of our lives together, on race relations and on women's freedom and similar issues. But I think the Vietnam War was the turning point. There was a feeling among many people that the government was lying to them. And the American people had not felt that way before. We believed what Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy told us, but things began to change. And then in the midst of the war, there was also Watergate. Then the workforce began to change. In the 50s and early 60s, we were in an unnatural period in the global economy. The rest of the developed world, Europe, Japan, had been devastated by the Second World War, and we're not yet back to the point of being economic competitors for us. The developing world had not yet developed. They were still trying to come to terms with becoming independent and overcoming colonialism. China was in the depths of the Cultural Revolution. Tens of millions of Chinese were dying because of communism. And there was no effort truly to prosper there. Russia was in the grips of communism as well. We had nearly half of the global GDP. That was an unnatural time. It couldn't continue. In the 70s and 80s, that began to change. It became necessary for 2 members of a household to be in the workforce in order to continue to maintain a middle-class American lifestyle. Certainly women much deserve the right to participate in employment, but for many people, it was also a financial necessity that both the husband and the wife work. And then as globalization continued, we prospered as a whole in the country, but middle class levels of income really staggered and then stopped rising on any real basis. On a real per capita basis, we're making about the same thing now in the United States that we made when I first ran for Congress 30 years ago. This is not because of trade. This is largely because of technology and increased productivity through automation. But there's been a failure on the part of our government, of both Democratic and Republican administrations alike, to do much of anything about it. We can't even get together to pass an infrastructure bill. I've been in cities that most people have never heard of that have better infrastructure than we do in the United States. Countries like Turkey and other far-flung places, Indonesia. And we're doing nothing there. What's partisan about infrastructure? As I said, we've forgotten how to govern ourselves, and many people have just stopped trusting anything that anyone in politics says. I find people who believe that because I'm a former member of Congress, I have a congressional salary for the rest of my life, and I also have free health insurance. And in addition to that, my children got to go to college for free. None of that's true. I don't even have a congressional pension. What I do have is a lifetime library card at the Library of Congress, which I do use. But when I tell people that, they don't believe me. They believe I'm lying to them. So how can we tell the truth to people who no longer believe anything that anyone who supposedly has any kind of expertise says? And how can we lead if people aren't prepared to follow the facts? One of your members mentioned quite rightly the fact that we haven't made much in the way of advances in diminishing poverty in the United States in recent decades. On the issue of climate change, I started working on that issue the first day I entered the Congress. I've been working on it for 30 years. That's how long the global campaign to address climate change has gone on. Since we started fighting climate change in the run-up to the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, since then, global carbon emissions have gone up 63%. That's not a measure of success. But here we are in the United States, the only country in the world where people doubt still that climate change is happening. And it's because they don't trust scientists. They don't trust people who tell them these things. Climate change is a battle everywhere in the world. There are vested interests that oppose doing what needs to be done to decarbonize our economy. But in those other countries, the fight is between interests. It's not over whether climate change is actually happening. Yet here we are in the United States, and given our political impasse, whatever efforts President-elect Biden and his colleagues and patriots may make, it's going to be very hard to pass anything in Congress relating to climate change.
Could I do, hey, Richard, could I do a follow-up on your question? Because when were you when you were in Congress, sir?
I was elected in 1990. I was reelected in 1992. I chose not to seek a third term in 1994. The following year, I was nominated for and became one of the first members of the appellate body of the World Trade Organization. So
what I was asking was, what are the procedures more like these days? Because back in the 60s, early 70s, let's say there was a 60% partisan vote within the Congress. Now it's at 90%, which clearly indicates that everyone votes against their beliefs constantly, which is one of the reasons we can't believe politicians, because they have to toe the line. Back even in the 90s, did you have to toe the line? I mean, I remember watching West Wing when they would get slapped back because of the fact they dare actually say what they really believed rather than what their party believed.
Well, my test was never what my party thought about me. My test was always whether doing something was the right thing to do or not. So I was not one of the people who even tried to toe the line.
Right.
There's a publication called National Journal, which I recommend. It's pretty much an objective journalistic magazine. It ranks the 435 members of the House every year on a left to right spectrum from number 1 to number 435. While I was there, I was generally ranked, so the halfway mark is 218. I think I was number 220, and then I was number 222, and then I was number 221. So I was pretty much.
Well, congratulations on being average. That seems like where you want to be.
Well, that's who I was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you do that anymore? Can people actually do that?
It's harder to do that anymore. I'll tell you some things that have changed. It was bad enough when I was there. When I came there in the 90s, this is a very good question, by the way, you've asked. When I came there in the 90s, there were people who've been there for 25 years who said, well, you should have been here 25 years ago. It was a much better place. And and nowadays, I still have friends up there in both parties. Some of them are in leadership positions in the House. A number of them are in the Senate. And I see them and they say, Jim, good for you. You got out when you could. My God, why have I spent my whole life here? But the partisan lines are much, much harder. Someone mentioned when I was introduced that I'd been on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And of course I was. I represented the area that included the Kennedy Space Center. I was also a principal sponsor of the space station, which we won by one vote, if you can believe it. And space then was not a partisan issue. What happened at the time was that most issues, even if they were divisive, were not party issues. They were not party line issues where either party expected you to toe the line. And it happened that most of the issues on which I was most engaged on a day-to-day basis, financial issues, trade issues, technology issues, space issues, were not viewed as partisan issues. So what happened then was, in order to win the vote, you formed an ad hoc whip team, and it was necessarily bipartisan. So I worked very closely alongside people with whom I disagreed profoundly on other issues, people like Newt Gingrich and Tom DeLay, if you remember them.
Oh, yeah.
And we worked side by side on a lot of issues. So I got to know those people. It helps if you know other people. 435 is a fairly large house. So you have to make a point of knowing the other people. And in order to get their votes, you have to know what motivates them, not what motivates you. That's how you build a majority. I was known in the House in a phrase that's now, I fear, no longer exists, as someone who can get 218 votes. Because my first inclination was to find the common ground, to see where we could build a base for a majority. That's how you legislate. And too many people now are not legislating, they're too busy tweeting and holding press conferences. The goal should be serving the people, and part of serving the people is getting legislation passed that can help the people. So that's changed. Even then, there was a tendency, because of the availability of routine air travel, to spend as little time in Washington as possible. And I went back and forth every week to and from my district because my wife and children were living in the district, and I promised to continue to live in the district, but there was a personal toll to that, which I paid because I thought I needed to pay it, to be in both places at once. But nowadays, it's much easier to live elsewhere because you're not required to be in Washington very often. And if you're not there, you can't legislate, and you certainly can't get to know the other people that you work with. The other problem is money, as I mentioned earlier. I'm not some naive idealist. I'm a practical idealist. I wanted to be in the Congress to get things done, and I had to raise money to do it. So I raised money. I found the people who agreed with me on the issues, and I raised money from them. And I was good at it. I raised more than $1 million each time I ran, more than my opponent. And that helped me get more than half the Republican votes in the second most Republican district of Florida as a Democrat. My views also helped. But nowadays, $1 million is a drop in the bucket. And nowadays, even legislators, forget members of Congress, but legislators and members of Congress have their own personal political action committees where tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars are contributed. At that time, only the leadership, only 4 or 5 people in the House and Senate had those PACs. And now the money is just everywhere. And now I've learned from those who serve there, now in order to get an appointment on a committee, you have to commit to pay, quote, dues, which means you have to raise a certain amount of additional money as a member of that committee in order to retain the privilege of being on the committee. Now, who is a committee member going to raise money from?
Those that it's being legislated against.
So, yes, a lot has changed, but it's much more partisan now than it was 30 years ago.
Thanks. And thank you for your service.
Oh, my great pleasure. No one made me do it. I wanted very much to do it, and I'm grateful to all the people around here who gave me the chance to do it more than once. I also continue to be mindful that there are hundreds of thousands of people who voted against me. How could they have done that?
Okay, thank you, Professor. We are out of time. We'll keep the Zoom call open for further discussion, but at this time, let me thank you for your insights, your patience, and your presentation. It has been our pleasure to have you and your insights and your wealth of experience. I think almost all of those listening to you would basically agree with you. You get a very centrist approach and we don't hear a lot of that. So thank you. So as a business club, let me remind you, please do business with Rotarians. And now for the four-way test. Of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Is it fun?
I ask you to be safe, be well, be involved, be a Rotarian. And we are adjourned.